Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Cusick. I'm the lead pastor here at Journey of Faith. And if you're new with us, I want to say a special welcome to you. Maybe you're here with us for the first time, coming back to church after a time of being away for whatever reason. Or you might be one of those people that's coming today and you're in a church service for the first time in your life, whatever your experience is. So excited that you're here. I hope this is encouraging to you. We're a multi-campus church, which means right now we're connected live with our Torrance campus. So hi to everybody at our Torrance campus. That's great. We applaud for them. They applaud really big over there when we hear, hey, welcome to Torrance. Everybody's like, yeah, we're here. So great that we can be connected. Also, if you're watching online right now, thanks for joining us. We're in the 3-week series, or week 3 of our series, Finding Home in the Unknown. And we're talking about how to live a flourishing life with God and with others when we're in places we don't want to be, when we're in those times of life that we wish we weren't in. How can we find meaning and value and relationship during those times? And we're doing this series because we're actually in a larger project as a church called the Story Project, where we're going through stories through the Bible and through Bible history. And we're at a point in Bible history that is commonly called the exile. And this is a period of time where God's people, after years and years of disobedience, are actually being corrected and disciplined by God, and they are deported from their land in Israel into enemy territory, specifically Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, which is kind of modern-day Iraq. And they're living there, and God is wanting them to keep their faith and to build relationships and actually work with and around the existing culture of their enemies. And they're feeling confused and alone and challenged. And in a lot of ways, we might have seasons in our life where we feel like we're in exile, that we've been placed in a circumstance that we don't want to be in. And it's very common when we're in those times to feel alone. And maybe you're going through one of those times right now where you feel alone. Let me tell you the story of someone that feels alone regularly, and that is my dog. I have a 10-year-old Shih Tzu, and he is a people dog. So he does not like to be in environments where it's other dogs. He wants to be with humans, in particular my wife, who is his chosen human. But we drop him off regularly at doggy day camp over at PetSmart. And so if you don't know what doggy day camp is, it's kind of like prison for dogs. And they have like a big room where they put all the dogs, and that's like yard time at prison. And so when my dog goes in there, he's kind of looking around, and the big dogs are all together, and then the little dogs are over in one place. The Rottweilers are lifting weights over here. And my dog, he's not a purebred, so he doesn't know what gang to join. So he usually just kind of isolates himself. Here's a picture of my dog at doggy daycare. There he is, right there, all by himself. Everybody's over here, even the human. And he's like, never mind, I'm gonna sit here. And I went to pick him up, and he saw me and just kind of sat there. And he's like, I'm innocent, I tell you. I didn't do it. Let me out of here. I think he's a Christian. He's just trying to just play it cool until I can get out of here. I don't want to mingle with people. But so he feels like that all the time. And I look at that picture and I go, I can relate to that. I feel like that in my life sometimes, where I'm just like, leave me alone. Or maybe I am alone. Maybe nobody's wanting to interact with me. But the biggest thing is like, I'm alone. Is God here? Is God with me? And that happens a lot, I think. When we get into a difficult circumstance in life, when we get into a place we never thought we'd be, one of those questions is, God, where are you? How can I experience God being with me when I'm going through a difficult place? And should I expect that? I mean, maybe if I'm in the doghouse, maybe if I'm in some bad situation, maybe if even in a circumstance that I feel like was part of my own doing, should I expect God to be there when I'm in a really bad place in my life? And I think the answer to that is yes, you should expect God to be there. In fact, here's the main idea I want to share with you today. We should expect to experience God's presence in the most difficult life situations. Let's look at a story from the Bible that can kind of point to that a little bit. Here's the story we're going to look at today. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Here's where we can find it in the Bible, Daniel chapter 3. This is a very famous story. Some of you might know this story. Some of you might have never heard about it. I want to encourage you to make a note of Daniel chapter 3 and read the whole story on your own this week. I'm going to give you some of the highlights. But one of the reasons I recommend you read it, and I recommend you read it out loud, because when these stories in the Bible were written, most people were illiterate. And nobody actually had a Bible. These are stories that were passed on from generation to generation through storytelling. So the way it's written is very dramatic and very exciting. In fact, there's even interesting references, and even the way things are said in the story, it is intended to be read out loud. So it's a great story to read out loud to yourself or with others. The story we're going to look at takes place around 600 BC. As I said, the people of God, the Israelites, had been deported into the empire of Babylon. And specifically, there's a group of young men, 3 we're going to read about today. This is their names here. Their names were changed from their Israelite names to Babylonian names, and they are doing their best to work with the existing government and the powers that be, and working in an environment that was actually very different than their own faith. And things seem to be going well until things get a little hot, literally. And here's how the story starts. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar builds this huge statue for the purpose of religious worship. Now, I was trying to get a sense of how big this thing would be. And so I found out the lighthouse on Point Vicente is 67 feet tall. So this statue would have been about 30 feet taller. And what did it look like? Maybe it was a gold statue that was standing there. That would be weird if we drove down into Palos Verdes and saw that thing, but then we wouldn't want to do that. Maybe it was that. It probably wasn't a gold statue of him. In the ancient world, in some areas it was common for the leader of a country to see himself as a god. Egypt is an example of that. So the Egyptians would build statues to be worshipped that communicated that they were gods. Babylon was not like that. Babylonian emperors didn't see themselves as gods generally. Their statues were dedicated to gods. Gods were invisible, so they would build something to make something invisible visible. So it probably wasn't that. The dimensions, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, it was probably more like an obelisk. And something maybe even narrow, like in the movie 2001, there's that black obelisk, and it was probably something more like that. Nebuchadnezzar sets this thing up, and he's like, we're going to now worship this thing. We're going to worship the God it represents, and we're going to make a big deal out of it. Here's what, going back to the story, it says, a herald shouted, people of all races, nations, and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground and worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, bowing down to a statue that King Nebuchadnezzar made wouldn't have been a problem for most people in that time, because most people in that province believed in multiple gods. So if somebody said, here's a new god, would you bow down to it? They'd be like, yeah, we'll include that. We worship a lot of different gods. We have no problem bowing down to that. Except for these 3 Jewish men, they are monotheists. They believe in one God. In their faith, they couldn't worship they worshiped one God. They wouldn't add other gods to it. So we already feel some tension brewing here. Nebuchadnezzar makes a threat. If you don't do this, you'll get thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, what is he talking about? What furnace is he talking about? It's probably the furnace he used to heat the gold to cover the outside of this statue. And the size of that would have required a lot. So this furnace is probably the size of a room, maybe a small building. There's probably an entrance in the front of it or in the top of it where you would go put the metal to be melted down. Then he gets word from some people on his team. It says some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. There's some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you've put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you've set up. Now, we have to question this a little bit here because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with Daniel, who we read about earlier in the last message, they're actually well respected by the king. In fact, the king put them in charge of things. So it's not like they want nothing to do with the king. They're actually very helpful to the king. They just have one thing they won't do, and that is that they won't bow down to this statue. And given the size of the province, and given all the people involved, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego probably could have gotten away with not bowing down to the statue and nobody would have said anything, except for these astrologers. Apparently, they might be jealous. And so these astrologers come and kind of rat them out and say, look, here are these 3 guys, you got to do something about it. And they get under Nebuchadnezzar's skin enough that he wants to call them in now. It says Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, he said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I've set up? And then he gives another chance. He says this, I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Again, Nebuchadnezzar's, he's worshiping all the gods. He got all the gods covered. But he's like, look, I'm in charge. I'm going to throw you in this thing. Which of my gods is going to rescue you? Here's how the guys respond. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you." Now that's kind of a bold, we don't need to defend ourselves. It could be kind of them really getting in his face. We don't think it is that. They actually say, "O Nebuchadnezzar," which means they're showing some deference. It could be like, King Nebuchadnezzar, we're in no place to defend ourselves against you. You've given the order, here's the consequences. We're not going to defend ourselves. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. You want to know which God will save us? Our God will save us if we're thrown in the furnace. He'll rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you've set up. Isn't it interesting? It's like, we won't do this, sir. Sir, we refuse. Kind king. You know, there's this balance of like, I'm going to stand up, but I'm also showing some deference here. I'm not trying to be a problem, but I'm not going to do what you say. And the interesting statement is right here. I think this is really cool. He says, but even if he doesn't. These guys were like, God will rescue us. God's able to save us, but even if he doesn't. They didn't know what was going to happen. They weren't sure that God would rescue them. All they know is no matter what the outcome, we're going to serve God. Then it says this. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. End of story. Let's pray. We're done. No, just kidding. That is where it is. But let's just pause here and go, wow, this is an amazing moment where you got to hand it to these 3 guys. And their names are mentioned. You know how often they're mentioned repeatedly? This is what happens in the Bible, that if you read through the Bible, you go, gosh, the Bible repeats itself a lot. You know why? Because it's written in an oral culture. You repeat it, so by the end of the day today, you're going to walk out, who are the 3 guys? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I heard it like 10 times. But what an amazing thing. They're willing to die for what they believe. They're not trying to be hostile. They're not trying to take over the country. They're not trying to banish the king. They're like, I'm going to work with you, but there's just certain things I can't do. What an amazing, amazing moment. They're thrown into the furnace, which is the hottest the furnace has ever been. And you can imagine Nebuchadnezzar sitting back going, we put those 3 men in there. They didn't want to worship my idol. Let them burn. This is where the story takes a twist. Suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them in the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed. And the 4th one looks like a god. He's so confused. So Nebuchadnezzar, it says this next, Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace, because of course it's super hot. Comes as close as he can and he shouts, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. He's seeing something miraculous happening and he's like, well, I guess their God is doing something. I guess he gets higher ranking in all the gods that I worship. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers and officials and governors and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. That was a funny little comment to add. They're like, wow, you guys don't even smell like smoke. I mean, what a great little comment to add in there. Nebuchadnezzar's shocked. He's like, what is going on? This is blowing my mind. So not only is he taken by how powerful this God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is, but he's suddenly kind of afraid of how powerful that God might be. And that fear creates in him a desire to issue a decree. He says, well, go back to it for a second. He says, go back to that last one for a second. He says, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. They're like, this is an amazing God. And then he says this, he does this decree. I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb. Their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There's no other God who can rescue like this. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Now, we don't think Nebuchadnezzar converted But what he did is, out of all of his gods, somehow the God of these three men elevated. And he's like, this is really important. We need to pay attention to this. What a miraculous and really unusual story. How does this story from 600 BC relate to us today when we're going through difficult times? Remember the main idea I wanted to share with you here? We should expect to experience God's presence in the most difficult life situations. Why should we expect that? Here's a couple of reasons I think from this story. First, God's plan for our lives is not thwarted by challenges. These three men faced the biggest challenge of their life. And God's like, a fiery furnace? That doesn't bother me. I can take care of that. I can protect you in circumstances. What difficult thing are you going through? That doesn't get in the way. See, when problems come up in our life, God doesn't go, ooh, yikes. How am I gonna deal with that one? Got my hands tied behind my back on that one. No, God's like, no, I got a plan. In fact, we've been reading through all these stories through this story project, and it seems like as you read through the Bible, God seems to be very effective in getting God's plans done, not by working around human beings, not by avoiding difficulties and challenges, but working in and through us imperfect people and all the challenges that come up. No matter what our circumstances are, God has a way of working in and through them. And by the way, this was a big, in the book of Daniel, and as we go through all of these stories through this time of exile, these are things happening while people of God are living in countries where their government is actually against them. I think sometimes we think, oh, what am I, like this is the last couple of weeks, what am I going to do and what's God going to do if the candidate that I think is most in line with God doesn't get into office? God's going to continue to do what God always does. In fact, that's the majority, almost the entire Bible, and specifically the New Testament, is written to people who were living in places where they actually had no say in whatever government was happening. And you look through history, particularly the last 2,000 years of Christian history, Christianity has thrived and flourished under every form of government and leadership. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say, what usually makes Christianity thrive is suffering. In fact, the place that is most thriving in the world today with Christianity, more people coming to follow Jesus with their heart and then turning that faith around and loving their neighbor, the number one fastest growing area of Christian influence in the world today is Iran. Sometimes we look out there and we go, oh man, this is a big challenge. I don't know. Is God here? Yeah. God has no problem with our challenges. In fact, we should expect it. We should expect the challenges. Jesus told us to expect them. Here's what he said. He said, here on earth, you're going to have many trials and sorrows. But he said, take heart. I've overcome the world. And maybe this is a challenging shift because sometimes we do put God in a box. God, if you're going to work, it has to be like this. That's why I love what these three guys said. You're going to throw us in the furnace. My God can save me, but even if he doesn't, my God's going to do, I believe my God can do this. But if he doesn't, I'm going to keep serving. I'm going to keep loving God and I'm going to keep loving people. And I think this is an important lesson to us because sometimes what happens when we get into difficulty is we move from being focused on the God of the Bible and we start following the God of certainty. I want to know exactly how it's going to play out. and then I put my heart and mind into that. Our culture tends to do this too. Believe in it. Our religious groups manifest it. Put all your, yes, you can make it happen. These guys were like, well, I know God can do this, but even if he doesn't, maybe that's what we need. We need some even if statements in our life. Here's an action step for you. Identify one area of challenge that needs an even if statement in your life. I want healing from this disease. Even if I don't get it, I'm going to love God and love my neighbor. Oh, I just want that job. But even if I don't get it, I'm going to see God using me in the job that I have. Oh, I want that life partner. But even if that life partner doesn't come, I'm going to follow God passionately in my singleness. I really want this candidate to get into office. But even if they don't, I'm going to love God and love my neighbor. Let's not serve the God of certainty. Let's serve the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where we know what God is able to do. We just might not know what's going to happen, but that doesn't change our faithfulness. Now, when you read this story all the way through, and I read it all the way through for the last couple of weeks, and I noticed something interesting I hadn't noticed before. Daniel is nowhere in this story. I mean, the book is named after Daniel. Daniel's the character through the whole thing. Daniel's missing. And you know where he is? We don't know. We have no idea where he is. Well, it doesn't say. Is he on a trip? Is he doing, where did he go? Some people think like maybe this is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego struggling with their thing. And then the next chapter is actually Daniel gets thrown into a lion's den to be eaten by lions. And so maybe these are like parallel stories. And Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego aren't in the lion's den story. It's only Daniel. So maybe it's showing two different types of challenges or sufferings that these guys experience. We're not sure. Daniel's missing, but there is a fourth character. Right? There is somebody, and it shocked Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is like, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed. And the fourth one looks like a god. Now, we don't know what he meant by that. We don't know what he saw. All we have is a record of what he said. Early Christians believed, and many Christians today believe, that this fourth figure was perhaps Jesus. Before he was ever born through Mary, it was Jesus. It was the second person of the Trinity showing up. In fact, there's all these interesting, kind of unusual stories throughout the Old Testament of a strong figure showing up, and people are like, who are you? Who are you? And he has these different titles, and this might be Jesus showing up at different places before he was born into human flesh. But the arrival of this fourth person is that great reminder that in the midst of our sufferings, God is there. And that's the second reason we should expect God's presence when we're going through difficult times, is that God makes his presence known the most clearly inside the fire. Now, let me say a little something about it. There is that idea that you learn more about yourself from your losses than your successes. Maybe there's a spiritual companion to that sometimes your most significant spiritual growth will happen through your most difficult times than your most blessed and happy times. But that doesn't mean that the experience of God in our most difficult times is the same as in our happy times. If I go out and look at a sunset, or I get an unexpected check in the mail, or somebody gives me good news, I'm like, man, I'm experiencing God's presence in my life. I'm so happy. Like, this is great. But if I got an unexpected bill, or an earthquake happens, or I'm suddenly sick, it's not the same experience. But suffering does something different to us spiritually. The old writer C.S. Lewis once said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pain. And there was an ancient Christian writer by the name of St. John of the Cross. And St. John of the Cross described a spiritual experience that people have called a dark night of the soul. And here's how he described it. He said, sometimes when you're going about your normal life, you might pray and you feel really good about that prayer and you feel like God is hearing your prayers. Or you read the Bible and you get some insight and it's so meaningful. Or you gather together with friends and it just feels like a warm, inclusive place. And you just feel connected with God through those things. But there come certain seasons when you pray and you don't feel like your prayers are making it past the ceiling. You read the Bible, and it's just dry. You're not getting anything out of it. And your time with other people, it just doesn't feel like God's there. St. John of the Cross said, God will intentionally lead you into seasons like that to get you less dependent on your feelings, less dependent on your practices, less dependent on other people. When you go through a dark night of the soul, God strips away all those areas of comfort and you're left with God. It's not a pleasant season, but it is an opportunity for refinement and growth. Some of you have gone through those dark nights. Some of you are in one of those dark nights. Some of you might be experiencing a dark night in the future. Know this, when you are in that dark night, when you are in that moment of fire and challenge, God is there. God might not be there the way you experienced God before. And it might not always match the feelings and the thoughts that you had before. But there's a new relationship to be had with God. And when you go through that season, or you know about that season, it makes you a great companion for other people. Because you can come alongside other people and you're not trying to fix them. You're not trying to solve their problems. You're just with them, like that fourth man in the fire. In fact, here's an action step that you can do even this holiday season. This week, partner with somebody in walking through a fire. Who in your life is going through a tough time, and can you just be with them? Notice that fourth man in the fire didn't come with like a supernatural fire extinguisher. You know, put out the fire. Let me put out this fire. You're not going to be. No, it's still burning. But I'm with you in it. I'll walk with you in it. What does it look like for you to be with someone who's going through something? And it takes a lot of faith to not try to fix it or solve it or explain it. That's the God of certainty. Somebody's going through a tough time, you go, oh, I think I know why you're going through it. Or let's think this thing out. Let's look at hey, let's go do a big inventory of your sin and see if you caused any of this thing. Like that's the search for certainty. The dark night of the soul, the being in the fire is when you say, I'm not sure what God is doing. I'm not sure when I'm going to get out of this. But I will continue to serve God. Here's what we talked about today. We should expect to experience God's presence in the most difficult life situations. And this story of these three guys in the furnace reminds us, here's why. Because God's plan for our lives is not thwarted by challenges. Whatever challenge you have coming up, God's not worried. God loves you and cares about you. But God's not like, oh, what are we going to do? And second, God makes his presence known, most clearly inside the fire. Not always a pleasant experience. Not always a happy experience. But the most difficult times in our lives are the opportunities for spiritual transformation. Jesus said, expect those moments and remember, I've overcome the world. I can get you through those things. When you face the fiery trials, remember that God is with you and you can be with someone else. Here's how we're going to close our service today. I want to share with you a quote from the New Testament written by Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends. And I think when he wrote these words, he had this story in mind. And I'm going to read this quote kind of like even as a prayer or a benediction for us. So would you stand? We're going to close our service here. Hey, remember, this is a difficult time, Thanksgiving time for people. So head out, get those bags, get that list, do some shopping. It's your way of coming alongside and helping someone through a really difficult season. And then if you're going through something yourself, you got something going on in your life that you'd like someone to pray with you or for you, down here at the cross, here at Manhattan Beach, and the cross there at Torrance, we're going to have some volunteers who would love to pray with you or pray for you, come alongside with you, kind of help you know that you're not alone, or at least be someone in that short period of time who can help you. Peter, Jesus' closest friend, went through a lot of things while Jesus was around, and then when Jesus left, the rest of his life was filled with a lot of challenges. And here's what Peter has to say to us as we're leaving today. Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. If you suffer, however, it must not be for murder or stealing or making trouble or prying into each other's affairs. Keep on doing what is right and trust your lives to the God who created you, for he will never fail you. God bless you, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.